Sandra Bullock was denied entry to a cafe, but what he didn't know that Keanu Reeves was the owner. Sandra Bullock had been working hard for weeks, juggling multiple movie projects and public appearances. The stress was starting to get to her, and she felt like she needed a break. It had been months since she'd had a moment to herself, without the cameras, the interviews, or the constant buzz of Hollywood. She decided it was time to get away from it all, even if just for a few hours. It was a typical sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, and Sandra was looking forward to a simple pleasure, a quiet cup of coffee in a cozy cafe. She'd heard about a new cafe in town that everyone had been talking about. People raved about its serene atmosphere, the smoothest coffee in the city, and the quirky, offbeat rules that kept it exclusive. It sounded perfect for someone who just wanted to unwind in peace. She drove through the city streets, weaving through traffic, her thoughts consumed by the chaotic schedule she had been following for weeks. Her phone buzzed, but she silenced it. This time, she wasn't going to let the world in. It was just her, the cafe, and the soft hum of a peaceful afternoon. When Sandra arrived, she parked her car on the street and made her way to the cafe, walking past the small rows of shops lining the block. The cafe was tucked between two other businesses, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But the moment Sandra stepped inside, she felt like she had entered another world. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of roasted beans and freshly baked pastries. The music playing in the background was soft and calming, the kind of music that made you feel like time had slowed down. But as soon as Sandra reached the counter to order, she was met with a cold reception. The barista, a young woman with a look of indifference, didn't smile. She didn't greet Sandra with the usual friendly warmth you'd expect in a cafe. Instead, she simply looked at Sandra and said, "Sorry, we're not accepting anyone else right now." Sandra raised an eyebrow, confused. She had heard great things about the cafe, and she'd come here to relax. "Excuse me, I just wanted to grab a coffee," she said, a bit taken aback by the abruptness. The barista glanced at her with a blank expression. "It's our policy. We don't let people in who haven't been vetted." Sandra frowned. She had never heard of a cafe with such a strange rule. "Vetted?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, still unsure whether she had heard correctly. The barista nodded. "Yeah, we have a strict policy. Only certain people are allowed in. We don't make exceptions." Sandra, unsure whether this was some kind of joke or a serious misunderstanding, tried to explain. "Look, I'm Sandra Bullock," she said, hoping that would clear things up. "I just want to sit down and have a coffee." The barista didn't react at all. There was no recognition in her eyes, no flicker of realization that she was talking to a famous actress. "I'm sorry, it's our policy," she repeated, her tone unchanging. Sandra stood there for a moment, stunned. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or to leave in frustration. She had been to many places where people had recognized her and treated her like a star, but this was different. She wasn't used to being rejected, especially when all she wanted was a little peace. With a deep breath, Sandra decided to leave. She turned around, ready to walk out, but not without feeling a strange mixture of humiliation and confusion. What kind of cafe turned away customers, especially one with such a strange, rigid policy? As she stepped back out onto the street, she couldn't help but feel a bit lost. She had simply wanted to enjoy some quiet time away from the spotlight. Instead, she had encountered this odd experience that left her wondering whether it was all some kind of bizarre prank. She had never been refused entry to a cafe before, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. On the walk back to her car, she started to reflect on the cafe's policy. There was something about it that intrigued her. The more she thought about it, the more curious she became. What was this place, really? Why would they have such a rule? What kind of owner would run a cafe like this, where you could be turned away for no apparent reason? Sandra wasn't used to being left in the dark. She decided that she would come back tomorrow and try to figure it out. She had to know more. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding, and if she came back, they would let her in. That night, as she lay in bed, Sandra couldn't stop thinking about the cafe. It had felt different from anything she had ever experienced. The smell of the coffee, the peaceful atmosphere, the eccentric rules, all of it stayed in her mind. She felt a strange pull to it, and she knew that she had to return. It wasn't just about the coffee anymore. It was about finding out what was behind the strange policy and meeting the person who ran it. The next morning, Sandra decided to give it another shot. This time, she made sure to dress casually, hoping that her low-key appearance would help her blend in. She didn't want anyone to recognize her. She just wanted to be like any other customer. When she arrived at the cafe again, the streets were quieter than the day before. She walked up to the door, feeling a bit unsure of herself. Would they turn her away again? Would the same barista refuse to let her in? As she stepped inside, she was met with an entirely different atmosphere. This time, there was no cold reception. The cafe felt warmer, friendlier, and more inviting. The same barista stood behind the counter, but this time, she greeted Sandra with a soft smile. Sandra hesitated for a moment, but she decided to test the waters. "I'd like a coffee, please," she said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "And maybe a pastry." The barista nodded and rang up the order. Sandra felt a little relieved, but her curiosity was still piqued. Why had she been turned away the day before, and what was this cafe really about? Sandra sat down at a small table near the window, watching the street outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this cafe than met the eye. Little did Sandra know, this was just the beginning of a strange and unexpected journey, one that would change her perception of fame, celebrity, and the quiet moments that could be found in the most unusual places. The next day, Sandra couldn't stop thinking about the strain. Café. The curiosity that had been sparked the day before only grew stronger as she sipped her coffee in the quiet of her home. What kind of place turned away customers? Why had they refused her entry, especially when she hadn't done anything wrong? It felt like a puzzle she just had to solve. She decided to return. This time, Sandra didn't want to rely on what she had heard from others. She needed to experience the cafe for herself to see if she could figure out what it was all about. She was used to being treated with kindness and respect, but this experience was different. She had felt like an outsider, like she wasn't welcome, and that was something she wasn't accustomed to. As the day went on, Sandra found herself growing more intrigued by the idea of this cafe. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how unusual it was in a city like Los Angeles. Most cafes were bustling with people, filled with chatter and the noise of busy baristas making drinks. But this cafe, if it could even be called that, was different. It wasn't just a place to grab a cup of coffee. It was a quiet, almost hidden world. Sandra didn't know why, but something about it felt like it held secrets. That afternoon, she put on a pair of sunglasses and a hat, hoping to blend in with the crowd. She didn't want to be recognized this time. She just wanted to see the place, to understand why they had turned her away. She drove to the cafe, parked her car, and walked up the same quiet street. It was as though the city itself had slowed down in this part of town, the pace of life becoming quieter and more peaceful with every step. When Sandra stepped through the door, the first thing she noticed was the stillness. It was like the air itself was holding its breath. The cafe wasn't crowded, but there were a few people sitting at tables, reading or working on laptops. Everything was calm, peaceful, and serene. The barista from yesterday was still behind the counter, but this time she looked at Sandra with a hint of curiosity. She seemed surprised to see Sandra back, but there was no coldness in her eyes. Instead, she offered a polite smile and said, "What can I get you today?" Sandra hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the situation. She wasn't here to cause trouble. She just wanted to know what was going on. "I'll have the same as yesterday," Sandra said, her voice calm. "A coffee and a pastry, please." The barista nodded and began preparing the order. Sandra took a seat at a table near the window, just like the previous day. The place felt different today, though. It wasn't as strange and unsettling as it had been before. There was a calmness to it now, a quiet energy that seemed to pull Sandra in. She felt at peace here, even though she hadn't yet figured out what the cafe's unusual rules were all about. As Sandra sat there, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere, she couldn't help but wonder who owned this place. She had heard rumors around town that the owner was a reclusive figure, someone who rarely showed their face in public. People said the owner was passionate about keeping the cafe private and selective about who could enter. But Sandra hadn't seen anything particularly exclusive about the place, at least not yet. The thought lingered in her mind, and her curiosity only grew. Who was this mysterious owner, and why were they so particular about who could come inside? Sandra hadn't been given an explanation the day before, but she wasn't about to give up now. She decided she would wait, observe, and see if she could learn more. Her coffee arrived, and she took a sip, savoring the smooth, rich flavor. The pastry was light and flaky, the perfect complement to her drink. As she ate, She continued to watch the other customers in the cafe. They seemed relaxed, as if they were in on some secret that Sandra didn't yet understand. There was a quiet connection between them, an unspoken bond that made the place feel like a refuge from the outside world. She felt like an outsider here, but there was a part of her that wanted to belong. It was strange. Usually, Sandra was used to being recognized wherever she went. People knew who she was, and she never had to try hard to fit in. But in this cafe, it was different. No one seemed to care who she was. No one seemed to notice her at all. As the minutes passed, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She had come here for answers, but she had no idea what to expect. Was someone going to come and explain the cafe's rules to her? Would she get to meet the owner? Or was she simply going to sit in silence, surrounded by people who seemed to know more than she did? Just then, the door to the back of the cafe opened, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, tall with a calm, composed demeanor. He walked to the counter, where the barista greeted him with a nod. Sandra's heart skipped a beat as she realized who he was. It was Keanu Reeves. Sandra had seen him on screen countless times. His iconic roles in movies like The Matrix and John Wick had made him a household name. But here, in this quiet cafe, he didn't seem like the Hollywood star everyone knew. He was simply another person, walking through the cafe as if it were his second home. She watched as Keanu spoke briefly with the barista before he glanced around the cafe. His eyes met Sandra's for a moment, and she felt a sense of recognition in his gaze. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He didn't even seem to care that she was a famous actress. There was no sign of recognition, no flashy gestures or expressions. He just looked at her, then went about his business. Sandra felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. This was the owner. Keanu Reeves was the man behind this cafe, the one who had designed the rules that had turned her away the day before. But now that she knew who he was, everything felt different. It felt like she had finally found the missing piece of the puzzle. But there was still so much more to discover. Why had he created this cafe? What was the reason behind the rules? And why was he so passionate about maintaining such an exclusive and peaceful atmosphere? Sandra didn't have all the answers yet, but she was determined to find out. She had come here to uncover the truth, and now she had the opportunity to learn from the man himself. There was no turning back now. Sandra sat back in her chair, her coffee now cold, but she didn't mind. The moment she had been waiting for had arrived. Keanu Reeves, the owner of this peculiar cafe, was standing a few feet away from her. It was impossible to ignore the fact that she had been sitting so close to him without realizing it. The actor, the enigma, the man who had cultivated this strange, private world was within arm's reach. She observed him as he moved around the cafe. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't distracted by the hustle and bustle of the world outside. In fact, he seemed to exist in his own bubble, untouched by the pressures of fame and life's demands. There was a calmness to him, an aura that seemed almost serene, and it made Sandra wonder how someone like him had created such a quiet, hidden oasis in the middle of a chaotic city. Keanu was busy speaking with the barista at the counter, but Sandra couldn't help but eavesdrop, trying to catch any clue that might reveal more about this place and its mysterious owner. He spoke with the same calm tone that he exuded in his everyday demeanor, quiet, measured, deliberate. The way he interacted with the staff made it clear that he was no ordinary owner. He wasn't demanding or overly authoritative. Instead, he was calm and respectful, almost as though he truly cared about the people who worked here. Sandra watched as he smiled and exchanged a few words with another customer, an elderly woman sitting by the window. It was a simple exchange, but it left Sandra with a lingering impression. There was a warmth in his eyes that didn't match the cold, rigid rules she had encountered the day before. It was as if, despite the strange atmosphere, Keanu was a man who genuinely valued human connection, something rare in a world that often seemed to be too focused on fame and status. Her curiosity was only growing. What kind of man could build such a place? What had motivated him to make this cafe a refuge for a select few? Was it about keeping people away from the noise of the world, or was there something more personal behind it? Sandra didn't have the answers yet, but she wasn't about to leave without finding out. She took a deep breath and stood up from her table. She approached the counter, her footsteps quiet against the cafe's wooden floor. As she got closer, she could feel her heart racing a little. She wasn't sure if she was ready to speak with Keanu, but something about the peaceful atmosphere made her feel that she had to. When she reached the counter, she paused for a moment, not wanting to intrude. Keanu turned and noticed her. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, Sandra felt a brief flicker of recognition. But it wasn't the kind of recognition that came with fame or starstruck admiration. It was the recognition of two people in the same space, sharing the same moment with no other distractions. "Can I help you?" Keanu asked, his voice low and gentle. His tone wasn't demanding, but it was warm and inviting. It felt different from the usual scripted responses Sandra was used to hearing. There was a sincerity in it, a quiet understanding. Sandra took a deep breath. "I've been here before," she said, her voice steady. "I came yesterday and I was turned away." She paused, watching his face for any sign of recognition or reaction. Keanu nodded as if he understood. There was no surprise in his eyes, no acknowledgement of her fame, no hint of judgment. He simply listened. It was almost as if he had heard this kind of story many times before. "I remember," he said. "The rules here can be a little unconventional. We have a policy about keeping the place calm and quiet. It's not about who you are or who you're not, it's about whether you fit with the atmosphere." Sandra frowned slightly. "But I didn't understand. I didn't do anything wrong, I just wanted a coffee." Keanu gave her a soft smile, a smile that seemed to say, "I understand." "I know, it's a bit odd, isn't it? But it's the way I've always wanted it. This place is more than just a cafe. It's a space for people who need peace, who need quiet without the world watching them. Some people just don't understand that kind of space." Sandra nodded, her curiosity growing. "I don't get it. Why keep it so selective? Why not just let anyone in?" Keanu took a moment to answer, as if carefully considering his words. "Because sometimes the noise of the world can drown out what's really important. It's easy to get lost in all the chaos, the rush, the expectations. And then you forget who you are. This cafe is for those who need to remember, even for just a few minutes, who they really are." Sandra was silent for a moment, processing his words. She wasn't sure if she completely agreed with his philosophy, but there was something deeply intriguing about it. The simplicity of it, the idea that this place existed to help people reconnect with themselves. In a way, it felt almost revolutionary in its quiet rebellion against the fast pace of modern life. "So, you created this place to help people find peace?" Sandra asked. Keanu nodded slowly. "That's part of it, but there's also another reason. Sometimes, when you've spent so much of your life in the public eye, you forget what it feels like to just be yourself. To have a space where no one is watching you, no one is judging you. This cafe is a place for me to remember that too." Sandra was taken aback. She had always admired Keanu for his humility, but hearing him speak like this, so openly and honestly, made her respect him even more. She could relate to his words in a way she hadn't expected. As an actress, she was always in the spotlight, constantly performing for others. But hearing him express the need for a quiet space, away from the public's gaze, resonated deeply with her. It wasn't just about coffee or pastries, it was about something deeper. This cafe was a sanctuary, a place to escape the expectations and pressures of being in the public eye. It was about reclaiming a part of yourself that was often lost in the constant noise of the world. Sandra could feel herself becoming more connected to the place, to Keanu, and to the reason why this cafe existed. It wasn't just a business. It was a vision of peace, solitude, and self-discovery. "So, what happens here?" Sandra asked, her voice quieter now. "Do you let people in even if they don't fit your rules?" Keanu smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Only time will tell," he said softly. "But I've learned that everyone who comes in here has something to offer, even if they don't know it yet." Sandra felt a sense of understanding wash over her. She wasn't sure what the future held for her in this strange little cafe, but she knew one thing for sure. She had found something here, something real. Something worth discovering. After the conversation with Keanu, Sandra sat back at her table, her mind racing with new thoughts. The calmness in the cafe was almost palpable now. It wasn't just the lack of noise or chatter. It was the way the space itself felt different. Everything in the room seemed to reflect the philosophy Keanu had just shared with her. The coffee, the atmosphere, the subtle yet purposeful design of the cafe. It wasn't a place to rush, to judge, or to demand. It was a space to be still, to think, and to find a moment of peace. Sandra had been in the business long enough to know that many people who had achieved Keanu's level of fame often felt burdened by the world's expectations of them. It wasn't unusual for celebrities to seek isolation or quiet time, but Keanu's approach felt different. He didn't just hide away or retreat, he created something. He made a space not just for himself, but for others who needed to reconnect with their true selves. Sandra found that incredibly inspiring. As she continued sipping her coffee, Sandra couldn't help but reflect on her own life. She had been in the spotlight for most of her career. Her image, her words, her every move were constantly under scrutiny. It had always been that way. But even though she had made a career out of sharing parts of herself with the world, there were moments when she longed for something different. Moments when she needed space to just be herself, without worrying about what others thought. She glanced over at Keanu again, who was still moving around the cafe, speaking with customers, and offering them the same quiet, gentle attention that he had shown her. It struck Sandra how he seemed so comfortable in his own skin. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, and he wasn't performing for an audience. He was simply there, present, and that in itself was something rare and valuable. Sandra had known Keanu for years, but they had never really connected on a personal level before. She had always admired his work, his calm demeanor, and his ability to stay grounded in an industry that often chewed people up and spit them out. But seeing him now, behind the scenes, in the context of this cafe, she saw a side of him that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just his acting skills that made him a great person. It was his ability to create something meaningful in the real world. Something that wasn't about fame, money, or recognition, but about making a difference in people's lives. As the afternoon passed, more people filtered in and out of the cafe. It was clear that those who came weren't just there for the coffee, they were there because the cafe offered something more. A sense of calm, a brief escape from the noise and chaos of life. Sandra realized that this was why she kept coming back, despite the strange rejection she had faced the day before. It wasn't just about the coffee or the pastries. It was about finding a space where she could just be. She finished her coffee and stood up to leave. But before she could walk out the door, Keanu approached her again. He gave her a smile, one that was warm and genuine, and this time she felt a deeper connection to him. He wasn't just the movie star she had seen on screen. He was someone who had created a space for people to find peace, to reconnect with themselves. It was an unexpected side of him, one that Sandra hadn't anticipated when she first walked into the cafe. "Thank you for coming back," he said quietly. "I know it's not easy, especially when things don't go as expected." Sandra nodded, appreciating his words. "I understand now, it's not just about rules, is it?" she said, her voice soft. "It's about creating a space where people can truly be themselves." Keanu smiled again, a little more relaxed this time. "Exactly. I think we all need that space, especially in the world we live in. People are always running, always trying to keep up with everything. But the most important thing is to slow down sometimes, to find a place where you can breathe." Sandra felt her chest tighten as she thought about the truth in his words. She had been running for years, constantly moving, constantly performing. But this cafe and the way Keanu had created it reminded her that it was okay to pause. It was okay to just exist, to be still, without any expectation or performance. In a world that often demanded so much, sometimes the most meaningful thing you could do was step away from it all and simply breathe. "I think I've learned a lot today," Sandra said, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you, Keanu, for this place and for the reminder that we don't have to be constantly moving to feel alive." Keanu's expression softened, and for a moment, Sandra saw something in his eyes, something beyond the fame, beyond the movies. It was the look of someone who had found peace in their own life, who had created something that not only brought them peace, but also helped others find the same. "You're welcome," Keanu said, his voice low and sincere. "I'm glad you understand. And I'm glad you found something here, even if it's just for a little while." Sandra smiled, feeling the weight of the world lift off her shoulders, if only for a moment. She wasn't sure if she would return to the cafe the next day or the day after that. But she knew one thing for certain: there was something special about this place, and it wasn't just the coffee. As she stepped out into the world outside, she felt different, lighter, more centered. She had come to the cafe seeking something simple, a cup of coffee and a break from the noise. But she had left with something much more valuable. A reminder that peace, calm, and the ability to simply be were the things that truly mattered. Sandra followed Keanu into the cafe, her curiosity mixing with a hint of nervousness. The cafe had a cozy charm, with warm lights that reflected softly on wooden tables and shelves filled with books and little trinkets. The smell of fresh coffee beans and baked pastries filled the air. It was the kind of place where people could sit for hours, working on laptops or quietly reading. It didn't feel like a typical celebrity spot. It felt calm and welcoming. Keanu led her to a quiet corner where a small round table sat next to a window overlooking a narrow street. Outside, a few pedestrians walked by, unaware that a famous actress was inside. Keanu pulled out a chair for Sandra with a polite, easy smile. "I hope this seat works for you," he said softly. "It's my favorite spot in the cafe. I like to watch the world go by sometimes." Sandra chuckled, shaking her head. "I should have guessed it was your place," she said. "I mean, who else could run a cafe like this without anyone noticing?" Her voice was light, but there was a trace of admiration. She studied the space, noticing the small details, a few plants on the windowsill, a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and the way the baristas moved calmly behind the counter, knowing exactly what they were doing. Keanu leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I like things simple," he said. "I wanted a place where people could come and feel comfortable even if they were having a hard day. A cafe can be more than just coffee. It can be a small escape, you know?" Sandra nodded, her eyes scanning the room again. She could feel the sincerity in his words. There was no pretense, no hint of Hollywood glamour or ego. It was just a man who wanted to create a peaceful space for others. She felt herself relax more than she had in weeks. "You know," she said, leaning forward a little, "this mix-up earlier, it's actually kind of funny now. At first I was annoyed, but looking back, it makes sense. You probably don't want people to come in expecting something just because of who you are. You want them to enjoy the cafe for what it is." Keanu smiled softly, a little embarrassed. "Exactly. I want the place to feel normal. Sometimes it's hard, though. People recognize me and it changes the energy. But when things like this happen, when someone sees the cafe first, not me, it feels right. That's why I try to handle it quietly and personally if I can." Sandra sipped her coffee, which Keanu had personally made for her. The taste was rich and smooth, with a hint of sweetness that came from a careful touch rather than a fancy syrup. "Wow," she said, smiling. "This might be the best cup of coffee I've had in years, and it's not just the coffee, it's the care behind it." "You can feel it in every sip," Keanu chuckled lightly. "I like to make sure people feel that. Coffee is simple, but it can also be personal. I know that sounds a little cheesy, but it's true." He paused, then added, "It's one of the few ways I can quietly connect with people. Just for a moment without cameras, scripts, or anything else." Sandra set her cup down and looked at him, genuinely interested. "I get that," she said. "Sometimes people only see the surface of things in our world, movies, awards, interviews. But they don't see the quiet, normal moments. I try to hold on to them when I can. It's rare, but it's everything." For a moment, they were silent, just listening to the faint sound of espresso machines and the soft murmur of conversations around them. Outside, the city moved on as usual, unaware of the two actors sharing a simple morning in a quiet cafe corner. "You know," Keanu said after a moment, "I've always believed that small moments matter more than the big ones. A kind word, a good coffee, a smile, it's easy to overlook, but it's what really stays with people." Sandra nodded again, feeling a warmth in the room beyond the coffee. "I think you're right," she said, "and it's kind of nice to be reminded of that. I spend so much time worrying about bigger things, work, projects, public appearances, but little things like this, they're real, they're human." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes I think we forget that. The world can feel so fast, so loud. But in moments like this, it slows down. You can just be, no expectations, no pressure." Sandra smiled, her earlier embarrassment completely gone. "I'm glad I got to experience that, and honestly," she added with a playful grin, "I'm glad I got denied at first. Otherwise, I wouldn't have met the man behind this cafe, and this coffee might have just been another cup in a regular place. Now it feels special." Keanu's eyes twinkled, and he laughed softly. "I'm glad it turned out that way. Sometimes life has funny ways of giving us the right moments, even if they start off awkward." They continued talking, moving from coffee to movies to shared experiences of working in Hollywood. But even as they spoke about their famous careers, there was no air of competition or ego. Just two people connecting over simple truths, the importance of kindness, the joy of small moments, and the rare magic of a quiet morning. Time passed quickly. The light outside shifted, casting golden patterns on the wooden floor. Keanu made sure Sandra had everything she needed, occasionally refilling her cup or adjusting the chair so she was comfortable. It was effortless hospitality, but genuine in every sense. Sandra finally leaned back, content, and said, "You know, I think this might be the most relaxed I've felt in months. Thank you, Keanu, really." Keanu waved his hand lightly, smiling. "No need to thank me. This is what I hoped it would feel like. You deserve a little calm now and then, away from everything else." As Sandra stood to leave, she felt a lightness in her step that hadn't been there earlier. The morning had started awkwardly, even a little frustratingly, but now it ended with warmth and laughter. She realized that some of the most memorable experiences came from unexpected beginnings, and a small act of patience and kindness could turn an ordinary day into something unforgettable. They exchanged a final smile before she stepped out into the street. The city noise seemed softer somehow, and she carried the memory of that quiet cafe corner and the easy conversation with her all-time favorite actor. It was a story she knew she would tell often, not as a celebrity anecdote, but as a reminder that real connections could happen anywhere, even over a simple cup of coffee. And Keanu returned to his cafe, quietly managing his tables, smiling to himself. He had created a space where people could feel normal, even when the world around them was anything but. And for just a little while, two busy lives intersected in a way that reminded them both of what really mattered. Sandra stepped out of the cafe with a light heart, the morning sun warming her face. She took a deep breath, enjoying the fresh air as if it tasted sweeter than usual. The streets were alive with the usual buzz, cars honking gently, people walking with their coffees, some chatting on phones, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Inside her mind, she replayed the morning's events, smiling at how a small misunderstanding had turned into something unforgettable. As she walked down the street, she noticed that the world hadn't paused for her or for Keanu. Life moved on, bustling and busy, yet in that moment, she carried a sense of calm that was rare for her. She thought about how funny it was that she had been denied entry at first. Initially, she had felt embarrassed and a little frustrated. But now, looking back, she realized it was the start of an experience she would cherish forever. The coffee, the conversation, the warm atmosphere of the cafe, they had all left a lasting impression. She smiled at the thought of Keanu's gentle humor and how effortlessly he made her feel comfortable. The way he had spoken about life, fame, and small meaningful moments reminded her that even in a world full of cameras and scripts, authenticity mattered most. Sandra passed a small park and noticed a few children playing with a ball. She stopped for a moment to watch, thinking how simple joys like these often went unnoticed by adults who were always in a rush. Her mind wandered back to the cafe. She thought about the quiet corner by the window, the way the sunlight had fallen on the table, and the smell of coffee mixing with fresh pastries. It was a sensory memory she could almost taste again. She knew that Hollywood often highlighted glamorous events, red carpets, awards, and premieres. But this morning had reminded her that the smallest gestures, like a cup of coffee made with care, could feel far more meaningful. There was a magic in everyday moments, something she rarely allowed herself to notice amid her busy life. And somehow, meeting Keanu in such an unpretentious, genuine way had reminded her of that. Meanwhile, inside the cafe, Keanu returned to his daily routine, but with a quiet satisfaction. He watched his baristas serve customers, listened to the soft clinks of cups, and saw the smiles of people enjoying their drinks. For him, it was more than a business. It was a place to create happiness, even if just for a few moments. And today, he had been able to share that with someone he admired, which made the day feel especially complete. Back on the street, Sandra continued walking, thinking about her own career. She realized that fame had often created walls around her, walls of expectation, judgment, and scrutiny. But today, those walls felt lighter, almost invisible. The experience in the cafe reminded her that the real world was still accessible, and human connection could exist beyond cameras and lights. It made her feel grounded, reminded her of who she was beneath the fame. She stopped at a crosswalk and glanced at her reflection in the window of a nearby boutique. For a moment, She just looked at herself, not as a celebrity, but as a person who had experienced a small, meaningful adventure. She smiled softly and continued walking, noticing people around her, some carrying groceries, others walking dogs, a few reading on benches. Life was moving on, yet she felt as if she had carried a secret warmth from the cafe into the world. Later that afternoon, Sandra called a close friend to recount the morning. She laughed while describing how she had been denied entry, her initial frustration, and then the surprise of discovering Keanu was the owner. She shared the conversation they had, the laughs, the small moments of shared wisdom. Her friend listened eagerly, and Sandra realized that telling the story aloud made her appreciate it even more. It wasn't just a funny anecdote, it was a lesson in humility, kindness, and the beauty of human interaction. Sandra also thought about how stories like these often became headlines or gossip in her world, but this one felt different. It wasn't about drama or scandal. It was about two people, in the midst of busy lives, connecting over something simple and real. She imagined how refreshing it would be if more people shared experiences like this, not for attention, but for the pure joy of human connection. That evening, as the city began to light up with street lamps and the glow from shop windows, Sandra found herself reflecting more deeply. She thought about the subtle lessons from the cafe, the importance of patience, the value of humility, and the joy of small gestures. In a life where schedules were packed and public perception mattered, such lessons were rare and precious. Meanwhile, news of the incident quietly spread online, but not in a sensational way. People shared it with amusement and admiration. Instead of mocking or gossiping, many highlighted the kindness of the encounter. They noted how two famous individuals had found a quiet, human moment amidst their busy lives. Sandra chuckled softly as she read a few comments. Even without intention, the story had inspired positivity. The next day, Sandra found herself thinking about the cafe again. She realized that the memory wasn't just about the morning, it was about perspective. A small mistake, a denied entry, could have been frustrating, but it had led to an experience far richer than she could have imagined. She appreciated the unpredictability of life, the way it could turn awkward situations into memorable moments. In her journal that night, she wrote about the day, trying to capture every detail: the smell of coffee, the soft light, the casual conversation, the warmth of human connection. Writing it down helped her hold onto the feelings she had experienced. She wanted to remember how it felt to be seen as a person first, not as a celebrity. Keanu, too, reflected on the day as he closed the cafe. He tidied the tables, turned off the lights, and looked around the quiet room. For him, it wasn't just about serving coffee. It was about creating a space where people could feel at ease, even if just for a few moments. Today had been a small reminder of why he loved doing it. Seeing someone like Sandra enjoy the space and the conversation reinforced the joy of his efforts. The incident became a memory Sandra would return to often. She realized it wasn't about fame or public image. It was about the simple, human moments that mattered most. Life often offered unexpected lessons, and sometimes they came from the most ordinary beginnings. Over time, she found herself visiting the cafe again, but the magic of the first encounter remained. Every visit reminded her of that quiet morning, the laughter, the conversation, and the warmth of someone treating her with genuine care. She carried those feelings into her life, allowing them to influence how she approached her work, her relationships, and even small daily interactions. And so, what started as a minor misunderstanding, a denial at the door, became a story of connection, humility, and human warmth. It reminded Sandra that life's most meaningful moments weren't always planned, often came unexpectedly, and were sometimes hidden behind ordinary events. As the city continued its rhythm, both Sandra and Keanu carried the morning with them, a shared memory that would quietly shape their lives in small but lasting ways. It was a story about more than coffee or a cafe. It was a story about kindness, patience, and the rare joy of connecting with another human being. And for that, both of them felt quietly grateful, knowing that even amidst busy, complicated lives, simple moments could leave a lasting imprint on the heart.